Hello, my name is Emili Wallace, and this spring semester I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Bronwyn Williams and Cindy Lincoln at the Naturalist Center and in Bronwyn's lab as an intern in the Non-molluscan Invertebrates lab for the Science Museum. So what I'm going to do today, of course our situation is a little weird these days, being inside and not going to the lab and the museum and whatnot, but what I want to do kind of just to wrap up my internship is tell you all about it and show you what I did and what came out of it. It was a blast, and I was really grateful to work with these awesome scientists. So to get me introduced and to start off, I just want to say that I am a high school teacher and I am teaching high school science, biology, and forensics. The way I become an intern is because I am also getting my master's in biological sciences through Clemson University, and so I'm able to be a student and intern, and I try to take as much opportunity as possible to intern with the museum because that is where my interest lies in terms of informal education. So I obviously have a lot of experience with formal education in the classroom, but informal education is also very important to bring science education to the public of all ages. So when I got a chance, I really wanted to try and incorporate some lab experience as well as the educational public at the Naturalist Center. So I was really lucky to be able to work in both the Naturalist Center at the museum and in Dr. Bronwyn's Williams lab. So that's essentially what my internship consisted of. So after work, I would go to the lab and I would work with Dr. Williams and Megan McCullough about looking at different organisms that are in jars and different non-molluscan invertebrates that showcased in the museum, but maybe not as much, and some things that were in the Naturalist Center. So when I was doing this and really getting to meet them and know what they did in their lab, I came up with a three-part project. So the first part of the project was to essentially start at the basics and really introduce this idea of wet specimens in jars to the museum public, because I don't know about you, but it's really cool to see these things in a jar in this liquid, and it's awesome, but you can't touch them. I mean, you can touch the jar. You can't touch the organism. Sometimes they're small, sometimes they may not seem as fascinating if you can't touch it with feathers and fur and all of this. So I wanted to educate the public. I wanted to make an infographic about what is inside those jars, why we use wet specimens, and how we maintain them. So that was the first part of my project, of my internship. I researched what goes into the jars, how we maintain these wet specimens, and what we do at the museum. So that was the first part. I created an infographic which is displayed in the Naturalist Center to hopefully get the public interested in what's going on in those jars. The second part of my project, I moved into really thinking about those jars and trying to make them more interesting and tangible to the public. So luckily, in Bronwyn's lab, we have a really cool 3D printer, and with that idea, I came up with the help of Bronwyn and Megan, 3D printing the organisms that are in those wet specimens, because if we can 3D print them, we can make them bigger if we need to. We can also print them and make them touchable, right? They don't have to be in the liquid if they're 3D printed. So that was the second part of the project, was finding specimens that we have in the lab from our collections, scanning them into a computer program, and then using graphic design to manipulate the different pieces of the organism, make sure everything was scanned properly, maybe adding different things, taking different things away. Really, really cool, and then 3D printing it. So essentially that went one program to 3D scan, one program to graphic design the organism, and then another program to print the organism. It took about 15 to 24 hours to print a couple of our organisms, and so that was really cool. I would leave work, go to the lab, make sure it was printing, and then I'd come back the next day after work and see it printed. It was really cool, and so that process took a few months because there's a bit of a learning curve with graphic design. This was a really cool experience for me because it was incorporating art into technology and science, and I really love how all three of those things came together. Okay, so the third part of my project also incorporated the art and the science and the graphic design by painting the 3D models. So a lot of times in the wet specimen jars, the alcohol that is preserving the organism is discoloring the organism as well, so they don't look like what they would have looked like when they were alive. And so that was the whole idea of taking these organisms and painting them to make them look lifelike, to make them more intriguing to a museum visitor. And so then I incorporated my education background to create essentially like a CART program or something that we could just interact with the public a little bit on, looking at the background that the organism would live in and what the organism looks like and why they live and look like that in that environment. How does natural selection and adaptation play into this? And so all of this was essentially the overarching program, the project I came up with throughout my internship. And so we focused on sea urchins, which is a non-molluscan invertebrate, which is really cool because they can be really beautiful. People typically know what they are. Sometimes they don't realize they're animals. Maybe they think they're plants, but they're really cool. I actually had a time at the museum to interact with guests and get them to vote on what I should 3D print, and the majority of the museum visitors voted on sea urchins. And so that's what we decided to 3D print and what we went with. It was really cool. The first time I started painting the organisms, I was able to do that at the Naturalist Center so that the visitors could see me painting, incorporating art and science, which just I absolutely adore. So without further ado, I'm going to show you a little snippet of the educational program that I came up with for like a CART, kind of like if we were doing this in the museum. I've got my paper set up. These are just a couple of pictures that I had printed and in color. So these are just some normal backgrounds that we might find sea urchins living in. So I have two different species of sea urchins, one that is found on the west coast of the United States and one that is found on the east coast of the United States actually. And one looks very different from the other. So I'm going to place my sea urchin models, which have been 3D printed and painted to look lifelike, on the environments that we find them, okay? And you can actually see in this picture, we see some others. So here's our first sea urchin that has been 3D printed and painted by myself, and I will zoom in on them by themselves in just a second so you can really see the detail. And then here's the other sea urchin that has been 3D printed and painted, and these are the environments that you would find them. This is a pencil urchin, that is the common name for it, and you find those starting at about North Carolina all the way down to South America on the East Coast. These right here, they are typically called a red pencil urchin, sea urchin, and these are found in more West Coast waters, okay? So this is typically what it might look like up against where it would live. So my question for you is, why do they look like this? This sea urchin seems to blend in much better to its environment. It's brown, purplish, it's got some things growing on it, there's white spots, and it seems to blend in with the rocks and the other organisms living there. This one, however, it stands out. It's very bright red up against its background, right? So why might this one want to stand out and this one blend in? I'll give you a moment to pause and think about this. Okay, so when we're thinking about this, hopefully you've been thinking about adaptations and natural selection and why might it be important to blend in? Maybe because the sea urchin needs to hide from predators, okay? Maybe this one doesn't necessarily have to hide from predators, but what does a bright color sometimes represent? Maybe it represents as a warning to say, hey, I'm dangerous, leave me alone, right? A lot of organisms do this in the wild, so that may be what's going on here as well, right? It sticks out and it's really beautiful. A lot of sea urchins are very brightly colored, so these are just some ideas I really want you to ponder and be thinking about how it applies to sea urchins, but also other animals that we might see and some plants in the wild as well. So what I'm going to do now, that would be like a demonstration of what I could interact with the public in the museum. I'm going to move the sea urchins away from their background so that you can really see what they look like in 3D printed. They're really cool. Let me see if I can focus this a little bit better. There we go. So every bit of this is 3D printed, and we would clip off some of the molding that helped it stay together, and then I used just basic acrylic paint. I primed it with one color, and then I just used acrylic paint and sponges to get the look that it has, and then I sprayed it with a primer so that the paint would not chip off when people touched it. So this is our first sea urchin. This was the first one reprinted and the first one I painted. The second sea urchin is much smoother. Let me make sure it's nice and focused. This one is much smoother and doesn't have as many things growing on it. You can see that the spines of the sea urchin are much smoother, and this one is brightly colored, but it was the same thing. I primed it and then painted it with just acrylic paint and then sprayed it with a primer, so that when visitors touched it, the paint wouldn't chip off. It is a little spiky, not too bad though. I mean, it wouldn't hurt anybody, but it's really, really cool to be able to touch and look at all the different things. And both of these models, what's really cool is these were original urchins that we have in the Natural Science Museum Non-molluscan Invertebrate collection. Like, these actual 3D prints are of organisms we have in a jar specimen, and all I did was I took them out of their jar briefly to scan them, and then I put them back, and we put them back in the collections. So it's really cool to be able to take something in our collections that you're not able to touch and really be able to bring them to life, right? So that people can touch them. It's really cool. So I hope you enjoyed my little presentation about what I did as an intern and my mini educational outreach projects. I really want to take this time to thank a few people for helping me and allowing me to work with you. So first, I want to thank Cindy Lincoln and Dr. Bronwyn Williams for, first of all, allowing me to work with you guys as an intern and really working with my schedule, a crazy schedule of being a full-time teacher and also an intern and a student, and with the COVID and everything, working with me so I can do this from home as well. I also want to thank Greg Scupian for working with me at the Naturalist Center. Thank you so very much for helping me set things up and paint and get in touch with the public. And lastly, I want to thank Megan McCullough for really letting me bug you all the time throughout the whole thing and helping me with the different programs and 3D printing. You rock. I cannot thank you guys enough. So thank you so much, North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences and the Non-molluscan Invertebrate team.